Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another day in the life as a military wife. I am, if you can't tell, really excited about today's topic, actually. It kind of plays in a little bit to last week's topic, which was imposter syndrome and that sort of stuff. But it's a concept that, in all sincerity, makes total logical sense. And I was probably always peripherally aware of it, but it was not something I'd actually like enumerated in that way before. So I really do try to keep up on what's going on in my field, even though I'm a stay-at-home mom by and large and a military wife. And so I'm not actively working in my field anymore as a researcher or anything like that. And so when I run across concepts and I'm like, wait, I don't know this, I like to look them up. And I ran across a concept that it makes sense, but I had not quite heard listed that way before. And it was the 6 types of courage. And I'm like, woohoo, I like this. This is fun. And so I kind of went down a rabbit hole and had a way too much fun with this. And I'm going to share it all with you. So I am your host, Sam Wolf, and you're listening to Life of a Military Wife. Okay, like I said before, you can probably tell I'm excited because I tend to talk a little bit faster when I'm excited. So I'm going to try to slow this down and be coherent about what I have to share today. But basically, I don't know, maybe you did, but I hadn't really thought about it before, but there really are 6 different types of courage. And typically, when we think of courage, especially as a military family, as a military spouse, when I think of courage, I think of the first responders from September 11th or soldiers in World War II or, you know, things like that, the big acts of heroism throughout the history and all of those sorts of things. But in all sincerity, there is so much more to courage than that. So, the 6 types of courage are physical, which is kind of what I was explaining before, social, emotional, moral, intellectual, and spiritual. And I want to kind of break all of them down a little bit, but then I want to talk about what isn't courage and how we can also develop our courage. And some of the research I ran into while I was looking at all of this stuff, because I learned things and had things brought back that I had forgotten. So super excited to share all of this with you. So we're going to start off with physical courage, which is what most people are probably more commonly familiar with. But there's actually different aspects of physical courage. So like I said, first responders, like a firefighter running into a fire, that is a really good example of physical courage. But another type of physical courage that sometimes people don't think about is those people who are having to overcome physical disabilities, and the courage to not let your physical limitations define you. And when I was thinking about that, the resiliency and awareness of their own physical limitations and still becoming a thriving person, I really thought of Helen Keller. Um, Here is a woman who, for all intents and purposes, had the deck stacked severely against her. But she ended up going to college, getting degrees, doing really incredible things. She never let those physical limitations hold her back. She had the courage to pursue her dreams regardless of the physical difficulties she was encountering. And so that to me is a really good example if you're trying to grasp another form of physical courage, but also resiliency, just being able to bounce back when physical things happen. Um, and that can happen to everyone. People, I was talking to someone else, a good friend of mine, about this because I just got so excited. And she talked about how aging could factor into that too. Having the physical courage to accept aging with grace and resiliency. And I thought that was a really good example. Um, Social courage, that really made me think of because it was talking about basically being able to go against what societal norms are for what you know you should do. And for example, I was thinking of Lincoln, and it also talked about leadership. So basically, there are chances of being rejected or unpopularity or exclusion, embarrassment for um, having social courage. uh, Lincoln's social courage to realize that, there are things we need to fix in this country. We went through a whole civil war because of it, but he wasn't going to back down and compromise his leadership and what he felt needed to be accomplished as a country, just because he wasn't worried about rejection and not being reelected or anything like that. And I think as a politician, not worrying about reelection takes a whole lot of social courage because that's their livelihood. And so to me, Lincoln was a good example of social courage. Um, the next one is moral courage. And as I was thinking about moral courage, it's standing up for what you know is right, even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. And that's really close to and similar to social courage. But the person to me who popped out in my head when I was thinking about this was Martin Luther. Here he was part of the establishment, he was part of the group. But he had the moral courage to tell off the Pope and say, hey, you know what you're doing ain't right, and he suffered severe consequences for it. And it was not like, he was, there were people who genuinely did not like him. There were people who did not support him. But the great thing about his moral courage was when he took that stand, there were a lot of people who felt the same way as him. And because he was willing to step up, they were able to step up behind him, and he led a whole movement. But his that wasn't his initial goal. His initial goal wasn't, hey, let's start a whole new branch of Christianity. His whole goal was, I believe in this, but there are issues and we need to fix these issues. And he wanted, his initial goals, if you read about his life, was to work inside the confines of the Catholic Church. And that just did not become a possibility because of the situation at the time. And yeah, his opinions were not popular with some people. So I really liked that one. Then, when it comes to emotional courage, this one gave me a really hard time because I was just really struggling to think of someone who I felt exemplified it. And it's following your heart. But like a lot of the different definitions I was seeing, they were fine, but it just didn't resonate with me. And as I was going through and listening to a talk, the topic of forgiveness came up and it really hit me. And I realized forgiveness is a form of emotional courage. And my mom would always say, or I'm not sure if it was my mom or one of my youth leaders when I was a teenager. Anyway, I very frequently heard growing up that holding a grudge or not forgiving was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't work. And that is so true. It takes a lot of emotional courage to truly forgive someone and let go. Now, forgiving does not mean you're going to let that person walk all over you again, but it means that you are going to let that pain and that hurt and that bitterness leave your life and you are going to move on. And the more I thought about this, a person who really exemplified for me this concept was Corrie Ten Boom and her sister Betsy. And if you're not familiar with them, I highly encourage you get the book The Hiding Place. It's about these two sisters and their experience during World War II. They hid Jews and were caught and sent to a concentration camp. And it's how Betsy, her sister, Corey's sister, helped her learn forgiveness so that she was not permanently damaged by everything they went through. And there's a footnote at the beginning by the authors who helped write this book about how when they met her, they there was a couple people who were Holocaust survivors and concentration camp survivors all speaking. And the first person got up and shared their story, and they looked just like someone who had been through this horrible ordeal. They were broken and tired and just they looked like they had really suffered. And then Corey Tenbaum gets up, and she is this happy, lively grandma with a big smile, with all this joy. And they're like, wait a second, they went through very similar things, and yet they turned out very different. And the reason is forgiveness. Corey was able to let go of all of that anger and hurt and hatred and pain and move on and help others do the same. So I think that one was a really good example. The next one is intellectual courage. And intellectual courage is expanding your horizons and letting go of the familiar, but it's also the willingness to learn and be flexible in your mindsets, but then also willing to stand up for truth. And to me, someone who stood up for truth, or people who did their best to stand up for truth regardless of the circumstances they found themselves in, were like Galileo and Da Vinci. The accepted wisdom, or even Christopher like the accepted concept at the time that the sun revolved around the earth. It was not just like scientific knowledge that he was going against the church's established doctrine. He was going Galileo was going against a lot, and he eventually had to step back and say, fine, I won't teach this actively, I won't push this on other people. But he never fully retracted what he believed. And because he found a way to work inside the confines of the culture of his time, his truths, the true nature of the solar system, that the earth revolves around the sun, was eventually accepted. And Da Vinci was the same way. The fact that they were able to work within the confines of the cultural situation in which they found themselves, to then allow that information to persist long enough for society to almost catch up with that truth, um, gave the foundations for scientific inquiry and scientific research that we have now today, and our understanding of anatomy and the solar system and a lot of other things. So to me, that's a type of intellectual courage, but it's also and being willing to accept that you may not know everything. That takes intellectual courage, and being willing to learn something new. Kids do that every single day. The last one is spiritual courage. So, spiritual courage is being able to face, just really examine what you believe and why you believe it, and come to terms, and then also being willing to stand up for it too. Um, a person that really came to my mind with about spiritual courage was Gandhi. If you, I don't profess to be an expert in Gandhi's life, but from what I do know of Gandhi's life, he was not he did not always live his life the way he lived it at the end of his life. There was phases of his life and phases of his spiritual development, but he had to reconcile the culture and the world at the time, the culture of his people, and his religious constructs, the religious beliefs and convictions he had. And then he worked within those confines of his religious convictions to achieve change. And one of those things that he had to confront were some of the cultural inconsistencies that conflicted with what the heart of his religious convictions were. So, and you may not be aware, but India at the time, and still somewhat today, had a caste system. And there were certain jobs and tasks and things that were not done by certain people in certain caste systems. And what Gandhi did in his community was obliterate those caste systems because he saw that spiritually, if we are all equals, then this caste system is contrary, this cultural construct was contrary to that spiritual concept that he was aware of and convicted to, like that had conviction for. So that's one of those. There's a lot more I could go into with all of these things, but with all of this research that I was running into, I came across a really phenomenal study. And honestly, I feel like all of us are going to be like, oh, I'm not Gandhi. I'm no Helen Keller. I'm not Lincoln. And we all expect to be these like big, amazing, giants. But courage is not in those World War II moments or those Gandhi moments or any of those. Our courage can be more day to day and more subtle, something that we develop over time. And there's a research study done by Nelson Good. It's called Courage, Its Nature and Development, that I just totally nerded out about. I'm going to be honest. I loved it completely. I had so much fun reading it and going through it. But in it, he talks about how to build courage and what is not courage. And one thing I want to go, and he quotes Aristotle, and I'm paraphrasing Aristotle and him on this one, but thrill seeking is not courage. And that is something I think sometimes we forget. There is a false courage that we have in our society. Skydiving, adrenaline seeking, those things are all all of those thrill seeking, or Aristotle puts it as fearless. Oh gosh, basically bravado. Like the person who runs in after a drowning child but doesn't know how to swim themselves. That's not courage. That's like, recklessness. So there courage needs to have a purpose. If it's based in impulse or adrenaline or exhilaration or any of those things, it's not real courage. So that's an important thing to understand, first of all. And then how do we develop our courage? Because I know that I'm not always as brave as I'd like to be. There are ways I could be more courageous in my life. And so he talks about how self trust, getting rid of fear, and having a purpose and a sense of community will help. And he breaks it down into other ways. Now, this is my interpretation of his research. So I'm just going to throw that out there. If you want to read his research study, go for it. I really recommend it. I really enjoyed reading it myself. But he talks about confidence and doing a strength inventory. Sometimes we forget how confident we are. We forget the things we are good at. We forget all of the things we've achieved. And so making a list of things that we're good at and reminding ourselves that we are capable, we can do this, is helps with our self-trust. And then courage practice, recognizing that not everything is going to be jumping in front of a bus to grab a toddler. It's going to be sometimes, for kids, learning how to ride a bike, uh, their first day of kindergarten. As parents, trusting our kids to be able to, you know, do things without us, that we've taught them well enough to go out in the world and be adults. Fiscal responsibility takes courage. Getting your first job takes courage. Moving out on your own takes courage. So there's a lot of things we do on a day to day basis, even that take courage. And it's recognizing those and using those courage practices. So maybe the thing you need is um, intellectual courage. You need the courage to be willing to admit you're wrong or to learn something new, get out of your comfort zone. Um, and or maybe you need to stand up for what you know is right. Um, I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't drink. My husband doesn't drink either. We're both members of the same church. In the military, alcohol is very prevalent. And we have been at events many times where people asked us why we're not drinking. And we've had to explain that it's our religious beliefs. And we've had people get offended and want us to drink because they think that we're judging them, but we're not. They're allowed to think and believe what they want to and make those choices for themselves because they are adults. But we have the right to our convictions as well. And so it is made for some awkward situations and some socially interesting ones, but that is a way we've been able to practice our courage. Modeling and observing, managing fear. So they talked about how there is a theory that fear can be finite. But I don't, not fear, sorry, courage can be finite. And they talk about how in combat situations, when courage will decline over time. But in his research, he's pointing out courage isn't finite. It can actually be restored, renewed, or developed. And one of those ways is through modeling and observing. If you have a really great leader who goes out and leads a charge, soldiers are going to follow that. But also, if you have a really great politician who's charismatic, people will follow that. They will rally to it. If you have a really great spiritual leader like Gandhi, people will rally to that. And that is an example of modeling and observing. And kids do that with parents and teachers and the other adults in their lives. If we model courage to them, they will learn that in turn. The other thing is encouragement. Um, and that is super important as well. Reinforcing people, hey, you're doing good at this. I'm so proud of you. And that is something we can do as parents a lot. Um, but also, that's why it's good to have a friend system. And that leads almost right into community. So, the another thing they noticed was that purpose, a sense of purpose and community also helped. Um, Soldiers who felt like they were fighting for a bigger cause, or Gandhi, when he felt like you have a purpose, you have a greater cause, you have something that's bigger than yourself. And that's a sense of community, whether it be your family, your religious community, your physical community, your country. If you feel like you have something greater than yourself that you are representing, that will help you gain and maintain your courage in face of adversity. So those are again, this is a huge topic. I wish I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to keep myself brief. And of course, my dog wants attention. She is being super needy right now. I think she knows whenever I get on and record, she's like, no, mommy must focus on me. Anyway, but I want to kind of leave you with a challenge this week to work on your courage practice and maybe do a strength inventory. Take this opportunity to sit down and be like, what am I good at? What have I done good on? Like, which one of these forms of courage would I like to improve? And what are ways I can practice? Or what are some of the strengths that I have had in these? And what is my purpose? Like my higher purpose. So I encourage you to do that this week, to go through and figure out what form of courage you would like to improve, and then use some of those steps to improve in that. As always, you are listening to Life of a Military Wife, and I am your host, Sam Wolf.